Peter Ruggiero's work quite well. So Peter's a professor at Oregon State University. So the work he does, and he's really an international expert on coastal geomorphology, coastal hazard predictions, and nearshore processes. And so a lot of the work that Peter does is also looking at how we can come up with new models and new tools to predict coastal processes and coastal hazards, ranging from flooding to erosion. Peter's been, if I understand correctly, you've had a pretty diverse career, initially working in state government kind of research, then spending quite a bit of time at the USGS, and then taking up his current position at the Oregon State University in Corvallis. So Peter is going to talk about, looks like a summary of quite a bit of this work that you just have mentioned, which is how we can, as a community, improve predictions of coastal processes that drive hazards, in this case, coastal flooding impacts, and dealing with the diverse kind of sources of sea level contributions that contribute to extreme total water levels. All right, Peter.
Thanks very much, Ryan, and thank you all very much for having me. It's an absolute honor to be able to participate in the Coast to Coast seminar on a Sunday evening in Corvallis. So I assume you can see my screen in the right version. Okay, good. So the work I'm going to present to you today is basically an attempt to try to improve our ability to take probabilistic approaches for coastal flooding hazard impacts, as well as risk assessment, and ideally to work towards helping improve decision making under today's climate, as well as eventually future climates as well. So, like virtually all the work that I'm involved in, the stuff that I'm going to talk to you about has been incredibly collaborative, and so the work is basically a collaboration between my lab at Oregon State University and Fernando Mendez's group, and I think many of you guys know Laura Kajigal quite well, and University of Cantabria, but also as part of this work, Patrick Bernard's group at the USGS has been involved, Mark Merrifield at Scripps University, as well as John Mara and some of his colleagues at NOAA. A lot of this effort was funded by CERDUP, which is a Department of Defense funding source here in the States. And then the last thing I'll say is that a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, and I think the paper I gave you, this is work that was part of Dylan Anderson's PhD thesis about a year and a half ago. Dylan's now doing a postdoc at North Carolina State University, as well as the FRF, the Field Research Facility in Duck, North Carolina. Okay, so that's a mouthful. So I don't really need to spend a heck of a lot of time with this group motivating why to study these kinds of things. But my research group's been interested in extreme coastal water levels for quite some time. So here's just some nice photographs from the US West Coast, looking at kind of the various impacts associated with high water levels along the coastline. So flooding kind of in the Santa Cruz area of California, flooding in a bay along the Washington coast, Grays Harbor, Washington here. High water levels responsible for erosion near San Francisco, as well as erosion and then subsequent decision-making and adaptation in a beach town in Nesquin, Oregon. And so all these hazards obviously are driven by extreme total water levels. But one thing that we've been interested in for quite some time is that there's a variety of different drivers of the various components of total water levels. In the US West Coast, that's particularly true and important. And a former student of mine, Nick Cohn, did an X-Beach dune erosion analysis, where he basically showed that for any given extreme total water level, say for this case, about a 7-meter total water level, we could potentially have upwards of 10 to 15 meters cubed per meter of dune erosion, or kind of depending upon the relative contributions of the forcing factors that went into that total water level, we could actually have accretion of that foredune. So this, among other pieces of evidence, led us to believe that not all extreme total water levels are created equal. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing has been trying to kind of suss out the various drivers of extreme total water levels. So again, this crowd doesn't really need this level of kind of introduction, but I'll just, the way we've been thinking about defining extreme total water levels, particularly on outer coast beaches, just simply summing a variety of different processes, mean sea level derived over long time scales, all the deterministic processes that go into astronomical tides, and then a variety of things kind of in non-tidal residuals that could be seasonality, that could be monthly scale processes, anomalies associated with things like El Niños, storm surge at kind of daily scale, could be river input if we're talking about bays and estuaries. And then obviously on the outer coast, the relative influence of runup. And so even with a very simple kind of formulation like this, you already get the sense that there's a lot of different drivers of water levels along the coast. And if there's not an extreme kind of forcing, such as like a tropical cyclone dominated coast where maybe the storm surge is almost always the dominant driver in extreme total water levels, then we need to be thinking about all these various components. And again, the relative contribution would have big impacts in terms of what the actual result is on the coastline. And so one of my former students, Katie Serafin, paired a variety of tide gauges along the US West Coast with actual either wave gauges or wave hindcast nodes, and basically looked at kind of the relative basically what these total water level probability distribution functions look like along the coast, and saw significant differences along the West Coast. And then the relative contributions of these are different in terms of still water contributions, as well as the relative contributions of waves. Again, thinking about outer coast total water levels. One of the things you run into when you do these kinds of analyses, that even in a place like, say, San Diego, California, for where we actually have one of the longest records of tide gauges on the U.S. West Coast, maybe about 100 years of record. So we could break that up into the storm surge contribution, the astronomical contribution, the monthly mean sea level contribution. But because our wave records are only, a handful of decades long, that's still a relatively small record to actually look at all the potential different combinations of events that might combine to drive some of the extreme total water levels we see at the coastline. And so Katie looked at those relative contributions by, this kind of 30 to 40 year record she had along the coast. And she looked at annual maximum events and was able to kind of look at the various contributions. So wave runup being a fairly dominant contribution, but the relative influence of wave runup varied along the coastline. But because we're faced with having this kind of relatively small or short data record, one of the things that she did as part of her thesis was develop a kind of a simulation approach, kind of a first cut at a probabilistic simulator for total water levels, and she applied that to this case as well. But even with that, we still had some limitations associated with her approach. It was not associated with the actual climate drivers that drive a lot of the variability we see. And so just kind of stepping back, in general, kind of looking at kind of combining these long records, we still have relatively large uncertainties. So if we try to do things like GEV analyses on our records, we might have fairly wide uncertainty bands because we only have maybe a handful of decades to produce these total water levels. With Katie's approach, that was an improvement, but we were still focusing only where we had kind of combined tide gauge and wave gauge locations along the coastline. We could actually get away from that a little bit if we kind of include, say, high fidelity physics-based numerical models. But obviously, these kinds of approaches are often computationally expensive, and potentially we're limited by a handful of scenarios which can be run. So these are just a handful of some of the kind of potential limitations associated with looking at extreme total water levels that really motivated the approach that I'm going to talk to you about today. So again, the kind of objective of this work was to develop a probabilistic approach to ideally efficiently evaluate coastal flooding, both with today's climate as well as under a potential range of possible future climates. And so the approach that we came up with is basically a hybrid statistical dynamical downscaling approach that's going to take advantage of a broad range of kind of machine learning techniques and data science advances, et cetera. And so this is kind of a definition sketch that kind of outlines where we're going to go with this talk. I'm going to spend probably about 15-20 minutes kind of overviewing this approach that we refer to as Tesla, which is basically a climate emulator that allows us to statistically downscale the various processes that are responsible for driving extreme total water levels at the coastline. We're going to develop a methodology to develop a stochastic traces of those individual drivers. And then we want to combine that with high fidelity dynamic stimulators at the coastline. But again, because those are oftentimes computationally intensive, we're going to take the approach of looking at only a handful of different kinds of combinations of events to actually simulate, and then develop surrogate models or meta models of those dynamic simulators, and then develop flood products after that. So that'll be the general outline of my talk. And then with time, I'm going to get into some of the kind of impacts products that we're able to develop when we actually apply this technique. Okay. So the first stage of this process is basically developing an emulator for both the short and the long-term analysis of the coastal flooding drivers. And we refer to this as Tesla, so the time-varying emulator for short and long-term analysis of coastal flooding. As I said, this was part of Dylan Anderson's PhD thesis. Laura Kajikal has also published a paper on some of the techniques that I'm talking about today. And so this is an approach that we originally developed to be usable anywhere within the Pacific Basin, but ideally with only relatively minor tweaks that can be applied really anywhere in the world. Okay, so the general idea here is that the conditions, the meteorological conditions that kind of force the various components and drivers of water levels, so the waves and anomalies, storm surge that we see along a coast, those meteorological conditions are based upon basically the synoptic conditions are based upon large-scale, potentially quasi-steady atmospheric and oceanographic patterns, okay? So we can find ways to describe those large-scale processes, downscale those statistically. We can develop approaches for generating probabilistic sequences of these total water levels at a coastline. The approach follows many years of work in terms of statistical downscaling that Fernando Mendez's group has developed. And so these are going to be weather typing approaches. We're going to develop weather typing at a variety of different scales. We're going to have annual weather types that's going to kind of really guide us in terms of whether we're where we are in the continuum between ENSO variability, so La Nina scale to El Ninos. We're going to have intra-seasonal weather types, so that's going to be variability within the Madden-Julian oscillations. It's basically just taking advantage of the fact that there's some intra-seasonal variability within the climate as well. And then we're going to have a series of daily weather types. And then those daily weather types are going to be sampled on a daily scale to produce the individual drivers. So things like storm surge, wave heights, et cetera, that are going to drive water levels at a coastline. Those daily weather types are going to be in turn conditional on the weather types at larger and longer timescales, so the annual weather types and the inter-seasonal weather types. And then once we have a daily weather type that we can actually sequence, we're going to basically sample from that and then drive an infinite number of possible combinations of those relative contributions to extreme total water levels and get around some of the limitations that I described in the first couple of slides. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail describing the weather typing approach for each of these different timescales. This slide is meant to be a fairly general definition sketch of kind of how we're doing this at a variety of scales. This is an example mostly relevant for the daily scale, where we're basically taking spatial variability of sea level pressures and sea level pressure gradients. So actually very similar to what Jennifer mentioned during her 100-second talk a few minutes ago. But basically, we're going to identify the dominant modes of spatial variability through the development of EOFs. So do some significant reduction of dimensionality through developing EOFs. So I'm basically just showing the top 3 EOFs of kind of Pacific Basin scale, sea level pressure and sea level pressure gradients. But while I'm only showing a top 3 here, we're actually going to retain as many as we need to basically account for about 90 to 95% of the variance in the signal. Okay, so we're going to reduce complexity first through EOF analysis and then do some k-means clustering with respect to the principal components. So here we're basically just projecting the sea level pressures into PC space with this figure right here. And so again, this is only 3-dimensional, but we could do this with any dimension that we want. So, you know, we sometimes retain potentially dozens of different PCs. Using k-means clustering algorithms, we can actually identify individual clusters of these PCs and then pick out the centroids of those. And each one of those centroids is going to represent an individual weather type or weather pattern at a daily scale. And again, this is a 3-dimensional example but we can do this with a large amount of dimensions. And so by combining that, the centroid of the PCs with the EOF patterns, we can actually retain kind of a what the weather type looks like in terms of kind of canonical space, in terms of sea level pressure, with kind of low pressure in the northern hemisphere, high pressure in the southern hemisphere. Okay, so this is kind of an example for daily weather types. And basically what we do is we pick a certain number of daily weather types that this is going to be a trade-off. We want to maximize the variability and have enough that when we sample from these daily weather types, we're actually getting a range of different drivers for water levels of the coast. So a range of different wave climates and water level climates with each of these different daily weather types. But we also have to have a limited number such that we have enough data to actually sample from. So we set a limit of having at least 100 days in the historical record within each daily weather type. And so we actually have 36 daily weather types. And we actually then also define 6 additional weather types associated with whether or not a tropical cyclone, or actually first kind of what we refer to as category 0, a tropical storm nearby the area of interest, and then categories 1 through 5 tropical cyclones. I won't spend time talking about the tropical cyclones in this talk, but basically we've got 36 daily weather types with which we can then sample waves and water levels from, okay? I'll get into that piece in a second, but each of these differently colored boxes now represents kind of a particular daily kind of synoptic weather type pattern. You can see variations between weather types that have very deep lows in the northern hemisphere and other conditions where we have highs in the northern hemisphere. So these are kind of our summer winter variability conditions. You can imagine very different climatologies of waves and water levels among those different daily weather types. Okay, as I mentioned, these daily weather types want to be conditioned on our other scales that we're interested in. For the annual weather type, again, that's basically our range of variability between La Nina here on the left to El Nino type conditions on the right. These plots are basically Hofmeiler plots of time and space varying around the equator sea surface temperature anomalies. Again, I won't go into the details of this, but basically it's the same approach. We basically do EOFs of that data set, and then we cluster the PCs, and we come up with these 6 annual weather types. So what's represented in these next 6 panels, each of one of these checkerboards is basically the probability of occurrence of a daily weather type conditioned on these individual annual weather types. And so you can see there's 36 squares here. Higher probability of occurrence are in the deep red colors, lower probability of occurrence in the whites. And you can see a very different set of weather types popping up during El Nino conditions than we have during La Nina conditions. And this is just simply the historical record, about a 40-year record that we're working with here. And so this is what we want. We want to be able to have our daily synoptic weather conditioned on kind of larger scale processes. I won't go into a lot of details of this, but again, using very similar approaches, we have EOFs and clustering associated with the Madden-Julian oscillation, and we're able to bin a variety of different weather types at the interseasonal scale or interannual scale, and we can see we could have changed our probability of occurrence depending upon which bin we're in terms of a intraseasonal weather type, okay? And then finally, this row here is basically just representing that the daily weather types also really get across the seasonality of the signal again, where per month, the probability of occurrence of any individual daily weather type is definitely conditioned on where we are in the seasons. So very different looking daily weather types occurring more often than not during the summertime than they do during the wintertime. And that's again what we want as part of this process. So once we've developed these weather types, we want to have a tool with which we can actually stochastically simulate that. And the chronology model that we're going to use is basically a climate-based auto-regressive logistic model, okay? And this is going to include these processes that I've been talking about, so ENSO variability, seasonality, as well as the MGO. So it's going to be able to cover that range of variability at kind of basin scale, all the way down to what's happening at a daily scale at a particular location. And so the idea here is that this ALR model has as covariates basically the seasonality. It has covariates the principal components of our annual weather types and the principal components of our intraseasonal predictor, which is the Madden-Julian oscillation. And we're able to then predict a sequence of daily weather types. And the things we need to predict are things like the probability of occurrence. We need to predict the persistence in any particular daily weather type, and as well as the transition probabilities from one daily weather type to the next. And that should be this next slide. There it is. So I'm just going to give a couple of validation slides. Some of these were in the Anderson et al. Paper that I've shared with you. But basically, the first and foremost thing that this ALR model has to be able to do is reproduce the historical probability of occurrence of all those different daily weather types. So on this slide, basically, each individual color is a probability of occurrence in the historical record of a daily weather type. And this is basically a simulation. So the one-to-one line, you see that we do pretty good. And again, because this is now a stochastic process, we can develop any number of time series of these daily weather types. We also look at the transition probabilities, and what I'm just showing here is actually the change in the simulated daily weather type transition probabilities. So the change from the historical observed transition probabilities to what we simulate. And you can see that there's very small changes, meaning that we're actually able to get that transition pretty well. So if we're in a particular daily weather type in, say, July, it's pretty obvious which daily weather type we have most likely going to get to during the next day, and we're able to reproduce that pretty well. So that now that we've quickly shown a validation of that, we can actually produce any number of length time series of these daily weather types. So this is a trace showing the probability of occurrence through a calendar, actually through 39 years over the course of a 1 year in terms of the monthly variability. And you can see that in the historical, this is basically the range of variability of the daily weather types that occurred during these times. And then a particular simulation with this ALR model does a pretty good job of representing that historical variability of daily weather types. So again, each color now represents which daily weather type we're in, and the seasonality is basically just showing that they're changing in probability through time across the seasons. Because this is a stochastic process, we can generate a different set of climatologies that reproduce in general what happened during the last 39 years, but the actual sequence of individual daily weather types would be different. But now that we have that ability, we can actually now generate any number of individual time series. So this is just a 10,000 synthetic year trace of these daily weather types, and you can see it really smooths out the variability through the year. So you can see that the probability of occurrence varies smoothly now when we actually average over long time scales. And we're actually able to reproduce significant variability of the contributions of these different daily weather types between an El Nino type year or a La Nina year. And so when we simulate for 10,000 years, about 1,400 years were El Nino years, almost 2,000 years were La Nina years. And you can see there's some variability in the daily weather types. All right, so all that's to say that now we have an ability to actually generate a time series of daily weather types at any time scale that we like. But we actually now need to actually sample those daily weather types from with the variables that we care about. And so that's things like wave height, period, and direction. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but in this approach, we've actually discretized the wave climate at San Diego in terms of the swell waves that are arriving from the northern hemisphere, as well as the swell waves that are arriving from the southern hemisphere after some of the work that Ana Rueda did a few years ago, and also having local sea-generated waves as well. And so basically any individual weather type that we're in, we have multivariate Gaussian populace that we're sampling from. And so this is basically a validation showing the empirical or GEV developed distributions of those individual parameters for a couple of these different daily weather types, and then sampling from them, we're able to actually reproduce those distributions quite well. And so we're able to now generate time series of the individual drivers of waves and water levels. So one more process that I haven't talked about yet in terms of more slowly varying variability is things like monthly mean sea level anomaly. And so what we have done here is basically developed a simple regression model, multivariate regression model, using the principal components that developed our annual weather type. And so that's just shown here. And in San Diego, we had a model that basically reproduced about 75% of the variance. We thought that was reasonable for going forward with our approach for Dylan's paper. We've been applying this technique in Oregon as well. that simple annual weather type only multivariate model didn't do as good of a job there. We developed yet another predictor at monthly scale using sea level pressures, and we were able to actually do a really nice job producing monthly mean sea level anomalies further north along the West Coast, reproducing about 90% of the variance of monthly mean sea level anomalies. Okay, so all that leads us to the ability to generate any time scale we want, annual weather types, daily weather types. So this is a 10-year record. Now we can obviously produce the astronomical tide, storm surge, monthly mean sea level anomaly, various components of waves. And then we can generate using a simple proxy like I showed you earlier for total water level. We can develop a 10-year hourly record of extreme total water levels, or of total water levels here. Here's just another diagram showing the same thing, but now sampling that out for 100 years. And now out to 500 years. So we can just, this takes only minutes to do in terms of generating these long time series of these various components, okay? And I just want to just show one more kind of validation that we're able to reproduce the PDFs of these different components that go into the simple proxy for total water levels. So this is another example from Oregon, like the storm surge daily max, monthly mean sea level anomalies, run up by combining waves, the wave height in the period, et cetera, and something about a beach slope, and then the total water level in terms of validating both the historical and then simulating long time periods. We do a very nice job of reproducing these probabilities of occurrence of these different components, okay? Now going back to what I was just showing you, back to the San Diego, I motivated this work by saying that it was hard to really get an accurate sense of the extremes because there's multiple components generating the extreme total water levels, could combine in a basically infinite number of combinations. So we're able to now pick out things like the annual maximum total water level proxy from these records. So that's what's shown here in red. And we can develop those 500-year simulations as many times as we want. And so here's one trace again of that, where using the count back method, we have a 500-year record of annual max total water levels. The fifth biggest record in that, the fifth biggest event in that record will be approximately equal to the 1 in 100% event, so the 1% chance event. So that's shown here in red. And so what I'm showing here in this set of scatter plots in red is about 100 different realizations of this 1% chance event in terms of the total water level proxy. And what's shown here in blue is the annual maximum events from all these different simulations using Tesla. And the point here is, again, that not all extreme total water levels are created equal. There's, again, basically an infinite number of combinations of these different processes that can combine to generate a 1 in 100-year event that maybe we're interested in terms of running through a dynamic simulator to develop a flooding map. So this is an example of the USGS's Cosmos model. They're taking basically how they've determined a 1 in 100-year storm event, and they're developing a series of flood products with that. But the issue with this kind of approach is that there's actually many different combinations of waves, storm surge, sea level anomalies, where they hit in the tide that could actually generate that. So we have a whole bunch of different possible combinations. And again, these dynamic simulators are relatively computationally expensive to run. Okay. I've got a couple other plots I'm going to move through quickly because I want to get to the next phase of this talk. One cool thing that you can go with this, kind of back to these squares of probability of occurrence of daily weather types. We know, which daily weather types have the highest potential occurrence of an annual maximum water level event occurring. So if we have some reason to believe that a particular daily weather type might change in its frequency of occurrence, then we might immediately know something about the extreme conditions of that coastline might change. We know the probability of a 100-year event occurring conditional on which daily weather type. So again, this represents the probability of occurrence. So we also know that the vast majority of extreme water levels are occurring, at least along the San Diego coastline, during ENSO, our annual weather type number 6 in this case. I won't go through this slide, but basically using this approach, we can actually do some detailed analysis of extremes, condition those extreme analyses on El Nino and La Nina, and see the kind of differences that we'd expect. And then kind of finally, even with just applying Tesla, as I've been describing it, we can, determine basically the probability of occurrence of these kinds of high water level events in today's climatology, as well as in their potential future climatologies, adding a sea level rise curve to these. We can actually show that this kind of event along the Oregon coast might go from occurring once every couple of years to potentially occurring several times per winter by applying Tesla. And we can again apply this in a stochastic approach. All right. So this gets me through this kind of first phase of this approach of trying to be cognizant of time. I'll go for a few more minutes here and then hopefully have time for questions. But I did want to show the approach that we're doing to actually now merge some of the Tesla output we have with kind of high fidelity dynamic coastal simulators. Patrick Bernard's group at the USGS was kind enough to let us work with their Cosmos model. So Cosmos is a model that's a kind of combination of WaveWatch 3 globally to a suite of Delft 3D and SWAN models on the continental shelf. And then they couple that with a suite of X-Beach transects closer to the shore. So this is an application that we've done in basically the San Diego area in Southern California, where we're basically interested in coastal flooding and coastal hazard issues at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, which is right here. So I won't go through the details of how we're actually going to develop the suite of runs that we're actually going to make, but we have to use some kind of space filling algorithms, and there's a variety that exists, but we basically need to determine a suite of conditions to take from Tesla to actually run through models like Cosmos. We use an algorithm called the maximum dissimilarity algorithm. And basically we use Cosmos to develop 21 dimensions. I mentioned that we've discretized the waves by northern and southern hemisphere swell, as well as local sea generated waves. We've got atmospheric variables in terms of sea level pressure and the various components of the wind field. And then on the ocean side, we have monthly mean sea level anomalies, and then a variety of tidal constituents. And so we're going to use Tesla to generate those kinds of boundary conditions. And then we're going to develop, we're going to only simulate Cosmos with about 600 simulations as determined via the maximum dissimilarity algorithm. And we're going to develop surrogate models or meta models of these simulations that we do, and with the goal to be able to pass through basically the full stochastic traces of Tesla output through the surrogate model. So then we can actually develop long time scale hourly estimates of water levels and conditions within the model domain. Okay. So again, here's kind of the problem that we have. We have Tesla-derived input conditions that are 21-dimensional. We have a computationally intensive numerical model. We're going to use Gaussian process regression techniques, but we could use many other different techniques to develop our meta model. And then we're going to then eventually be able to do hazards or risk assessments using these kinds of approaches. So this is just a quick validation of this approach. So again, we run Cosmos. We start off with running it 600 times. We do a K-folding assessment by basically, we're going to calculate water level at one location. We're going to withhold 120 of those 600 simulations. And then we're going to do an analysis of how well we're able to reproduce the water levels that Delft 3D produces with this surrogate model. And so this is basically just how well is the Gaussian process regression approach able to reproduce water levels that Delft 3D gives us. And as you can see, it does a pretty fantastic job of getting that model-derived water level with this K-folding approach. So RMS errors of about 5 centimeters, very excellent R-squared values. But that's not really what we're up to here. What we really want to do is produce real water level conditions in the bay itself. This is just showing that there's a certain number of runs where the errors kind of zero out. So we ran 600 cases. We probably didn't have to run all 600 cases for this approach. But here we're actually now looking at the actual tide gauge. So now this is actually applying the meta model and looking actually at a real world measurements of water levels at a tide gauge, at a fortnight scale, at an annual scale, and at a multi-decadal scale. And as you can see, by passing boundary conditions, 21-dimensional boundary conditions through this surrogate model, we actually do a very good job of reproducing the water levels at any location within the model domain. So again, this Gaussian process regression approach is doing quite a decent job of reproducing the water level variability that we're seeing within the bay. RMS errors on the order of about a decimeter in this case. So now that we have this ability to actually pass Tesla-derived input conditions through a surrogate model that we think has some ability to reproduce water level conditions, we can now do a variety of impact assessments, which was sort of our goal from the beginning. And so here's a case where we're actually looking at one of the Navy's piers inside of San Diego Bay by having conversations with them. We know certain elevations of water levels with which some of the infrastructure along these piers, that the piers become no longer functional. And so one thing that we're interested in is, by using this approach, can we actually determine when and how often and under which conditions these piers might no longer have certain functionality. And that might trigger certain decision making that the Navy might have to do in terms of managing their infrastructure. So here's a water level signal where we've actually applied a particular sea level rise scenario, but we're able to reproduce by passing Tesla-derived input conditions. So this is about a 90-year simulation from Tesla, passed through this surrogate model of Delft3D. We get an hourly time series of water level. We're able to then produce from this a metric such as the number of days per year with which water is exceeding the pier use threshold that we've determined. And you can see that under some sea level rise scenarios, we start hitting that threshold earlier in the century than with other sea level rise scenarios. And again, because we're using a stochastic approach, we can do this dozens and dozens of times. We can actually produce, based upon a particular sea level rise projection, we can actually produce a statistical analysis of how often that might actually occur into the future. So that's one of the approaches that we could utilize this methodology for. Another thing we've been looking at is looking at water levels on the outer coast. And so we need not just Delft3D here, we need to actually combine the X-Beach simulation that's part of Cosmos with this. And so in this case, there's a loosely coupled X-Beach model with Delft3D. And we actually have some observations of water levels from Mark Merrifield's group at Scripps offshore of one of the locations that we have an X-Beach transect. And this is basically just showing where those water level observations were made. And again, we're passing Tesla-derived boundary conditions through this suite of meta models to reproduce water levels from X-Beach and comparing that to actually observations made by a series of pressure sensors that Mark Merrifield's group has deployed. And you can see that depending upon where we are, we do a reasonably good job of actually reproducing the water levels associated with what happened in actual observations using this kind of coupled modeling platform, passing through Tesla input conditions and using meta models. And so with that, we feel like we had reasonable confidence that we can go through and actually develop more kind of impact kind of assessments. So in this case, we can actually make a meta model of runup on the beach here. And so fronting the infrastructure of the Navy, they actually construct a berm. And so we could actually calculate how high the runup gets along that constructed berm, again, with various sea level rise scenarios that are included in some of these diagrams. And we could actually do things like calculate, how often we're in some of the various Salinger impact regimes. So whether or not we're in the overwash regime, how often we're overtopping this constructed berm, or how often we're in a collision regime. And that's shown here in this middle panel. And then finally, by developing yet another surrogate model, we use a random forest type machine learning approach to determine just the yes/no question of whether or not we've overtopped this elevation contour. If the answer is yes, then we can actually then develop a Gaussian process regression surrogate model of what the inundation water depth might be in the backshore. And that's just what's shown here in the bottom panel is the inundation depth associated with these various conditions if we have overtopping conditions. It doesn't happen that often, but when it does, we can actually fill up the backshore infrastructure with some water. So obviously these are all occurring with fixed bathymetric profiles. We're not evolving the morphology, but we can do things that are relevant for morphological evolution. All right, and this is probably my favorite plot of this kind of sequence. I like to call this the volleyball plot, One of the things that the Navy is also interested in is a series of outer coast training exercises that they do. I've reduced that down to how often they can play volleyball, but I'm guessing they do a variety of other things at this location. But basically the metric here that we're interested in is something basically is how often during the daylight do we have a beach width that's wide enough for a certain amount of Navy training. So we determine what that necessary beach width is. At present day climate, we basically have as many hours in the day as we need to do any kind of training or activities along the beach. But this metric starts to decrease pretty significantly by a little bit before mid-century as water levels start to increase onto the beach, and sea level rise is bringing water level closer and closer. And again, because we have a stochastic approach, we can actually develop whisker plots and have some uncertainty associated with, again, when and where we can play volleyball along this coastline. All right. So I know I've done this pretty quickly, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of what we've produced here. So this Tesla approach is basically a hybrid statistical dynamical downscaling approach to produce stochastic spatially varying extreme total water levels for a variety of different kind of coastal flood risk analyses. I touched on a few of these, but there's a variety of different machine learning algorithms within it. But basically what we've done is we've reduced the dimensionality significantly with this problem by developing the climate emulator to begin with. And then we reduced a lot of the computational burden associated with running high fidelity models over and over again by basically developing these machine learning derived surrogate models. And then I'll just leave you with the final slide, kind of a variety of things that we're still doing now. So we're kind of in the fun/hard part of kind of applying this technique in a variety of locations around the Pacific Basin, doing things like developing probabilistic assessments of coastal flooding and erosion probability. Again, thinking about kind of decision-making, resilience planning, but there's a variety of other things that potentially could be done with this kind of stochastic emulator of the drivers for total water levels or the drivers for a variety of the other processes that we care about in terms of coastal processes. So I think I'll stop there. Thanks very much for your patience.
Thanks a lot, Peter. So I think it's time for a few questions. I think Kristen posted one. I don't know if she wants to ask it in person or Kristen?
I can if you want. I'm assuming you're not referring to the Top Gun vibe.
No.
Part of it. I was picturing it. Thanks, Peter. Enjoyed that. The more serious question that I did have was thank you for a great talk. The sites that you've presented here and you tested this on seem to be really highly seasonal. And so can the approach be applied robustly, or have you guys tried it on sites that don't have such strong seasonality, where weather types might be more common all year or lack and so variability like these cases on the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kristen. Fernando actually has told me several times recently that my group got the easier cases that are more ENSO dominated. So we've been working along the US, the North American coast, as well as in Hawaii. And he's been working in the Marshall Islands as well as in Guam. And so a little bit trickier to tease out the variability, a little bit trickier to get monthly mean sea level anomalies well with these kinds of approaches. But I think there's also a little bit less variability from the monthly mean sea level anomalies, so it's maybe not such a big deal. But I think one of my slides had, I think the previous slide had this GitHub site for Tesla Kit. So that's actually a site that people can go to and look at the Jupyter notebooks that have been developed for developing this approach at a variety of these sites around the world, and kind of get to the bottom of that question. But mostly we've been looking at OSU, we've been working with some of the more seasonal and ENSO dominated sites. And Fernando's group has been struggling with the other ones, but it's a good point.
So question from Ron. Do you want to, if you were there, Ron, I could ask that directly, or?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, good talk, Peter. Enjoyed that. Look, Kristen's question kind of went, or your answer to it kind of went there. I mean, I guess I noticed in one or two of your histograms in Oregon, it looks like you missed just a little bit of the center of the variability, I guess the most commonly occurring thing. But I guess a thought occurred to me that, so you're reconstructing the monthly the daily sea level pressure with EOFs, and then doing the k-means clustering on that, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, is there a possibility that there's some really weird, unusual weather type that crops up a little bit that would fall out of that EOF analysis that might lead to an extreme? I mean, I'm trying to recall spatial extremes, or would that by definition be captured? It might not be. It might be a big signal in the noise. So is there, I don't know, I guess, can you talk to that?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. So, by definition, every day will fit into one of the daily weather types that we define. So in this case, we have 36 weather types. So any condition that occurred during the historical, the time we have observations, will fit into one of those daily weather types. But I think you're right in that it might kind of gloss over the details of that particular event, because it might be on the edge of maybe being between a couple weather types. So you get around that by adding more weather types, daily weather types, and then you have the ability to kind of really refine the variability associated with the synoptic weather. But then you have the issue that you don't have as much data that is defining your Gaussian copulus. So there's always trade-offs. I think Dylan did do a little bit of a sensitivity analysis in a paper, and I think the methodology worked fine for about 60 weather types down to about 32 weather types. But with the higher number of weather types, you just have less data in the copulus, and so you have a problem with that trade-off as well. So you're right, particularly if whatever's driving that freak event that you're just talking about, if that that process changes with future climate, then we might not be picking that up, which is one of the things that we're moving towards with this approach in general, is trying to think about other things besides just sea level rise. So, what about the changing magnitude and frequency of ENSO variability? Can that be downscaled from GCM results to this approach? And so we're just starting to play with some of those things now.
Okay, so we probably have time for two quick